if everyone will allow me to kind of reintroduce our speakers and our guests for today, and we'll start on our far left again with Dr. Lamar Reich, who we've had the privilege of listening to a couple of times already. Again, Dr. Reich is home again, LCU graduate, been to South Africa many times, a lot of expertise as we know already. Excuse me. Next to Dr. Reich is Chris Dowdy, who we had the privilege of listening to over lunch. Chris has his PhD in Christian ethics from SMU and now works at Paul Quinn University. Had some really challenging things for me to say at lunch, and I know he will again here. Next to Chris is Rachel Snyder-Vlachos, who used to work at LCU and is pursuing her PhD at Rice University. And then next to Rachel is Crystal Silva McCormick, graduate of LCU as well, and a PhD candidate in interfaith studies at Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. What I would like to do today, and my role here is to hopefully get out of the way and let our panelists speak about their expertise. And so what I would like to encourage us to do, especially you guys in the audience, if you have questions, treat this more like a round table, if that's okay with our guest. If you have a question, please raise your hand and ask them a question. We've got about an hour that we can have a conversation. And so it would be beneficial to them. And I am no Charlie Rose, and so my job is to just get out of the way today if I can. So let me sit down, and if I can, let's just start this way. And if you guys can tell us your story, your interest, your particular field of study, and kind of why you're here, and what your expertise is on truth and reconciliation.
Hi, I'm Crystal, and I study interfaith studies, so I work with people from different religious backgrounds quite often, different cultural and racial backgrounds, biracial myself, and that's important to my identity. I also work with Christians from a variety of backgrounds, really conservative, really moderate, really progressive, and I think that's really important because a lot of times we resist issues because we find ourselves identifying with a particular brand of Christianity or religiosity, and we resist particular issues because we say, well, this is where we need to align ourselves, as opposed to striving for what the gospel says primarily. And so I see myself, regardless of what I'm studying or what I'm doing, first as pastor. I'm an associate pastor at church, so I always think of myself as pastor. And when I talk with someone or I'm with someone, I want to listen to what they care for, and primarily it's always about the gospel. And I want to walk with them in the journey of trying to figure out how to live that out and not resist, or to resist this left and right and middle way, and just seek what is the gospel. So I hope that with respect to truth and reconciliation, that we can do that together in our communities and our universities and for our country and for the world.
My name's Rachel. I am currently getting a PhD at Rice, and I study race and religion. I particularly studied in South Africa because South Africa is the place that really opened my eyes to the really complicated role that race and religion often have to one another. When I went to a Christian university, Seattle Pacific University, and when I was 19, I went on a short-term mission trip, just randomly got placed on a team to South Africa to learn about racial reconciliation and peace building. I knew absolutely nothing about South Africa. I hadn't even actually ever heard the term apartheid, which speaks, I think now in retrospect, to the kind of world that I grew up in, a world that was very much built to shield me as a white American about the realities of race and about our racial history here in the United States. And so it took traveling to South Africa, where I was totally outside of my context, and all of a sudden I was placed in a host family for 5 weeks. They were classified as colored under apartheid. And all of a sudden, I'm hearing their stories of pain and suffering under apartheid, and I am hearing how their families were displaced due to the Group Areas Act, and they were the first family after apartheid to move into a white neighborhood. The father is a lawyer, highly educated, and I just felt so connected in some way to both their stories, but also realizing that in many ways I was the representation of people that had caused great suffering in their lives. And so that just started a journey for me of wrestling with my own identity, I guess, as a privileged person, as a white person, as an American. And just really quick, one fundamental issue that happened while I was in South Africa was that I could have walked away feeling like, oh, those bad white people over there. And what turned the tables was one moment where I was talking with some people who'd been very involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, and we were processing as a group, and they turned to me and they said, okay, so you've been learning about apartheid. How does it feel to be part of a country that practices apartheid against the rest of the world? And by that they meant a country that consumes more than its share of the world's resources, that benefits itself over others, and then also just to think about our own history of apartheid here in the United States. And that really led me to say that I can't make it about something out there. I have to make it about me. And that has led me to really engage with what truth and justice and reconciliation look like in my own life.
Thanks, that was freaking me out, so that's helpful. My great-grandparents, on my mother's side, they met at a boarding school, which is why on that fraction of my mom's side, my tribal heritage is mixed tribe, Ojibwe and Cherokee, because they were sort of displaced. We're allowed to speak the language during the day and that kind of thing. The story, and I don't know all the story now, of how my grandfather went from living on a ranch in Bunge, Oklahoma, to being a worker in an auto factory in Detroit, is the story of my grandfather's assimilation from being a tribal adjacent person to being essentially an immigrant who was absorbing whiteness, being assimilated into whiteness in Detroit in the 50s. And I've struggled for a long time as a young person to understand what that story meant and what it meant to have that part of my, that truth as a part of my body, in addition to like the Welsh parts and the Irish parts and whatever other spare parts, a part of this particular experience that I have. And from my mother, she didn't have we have maintained tribal affiliation, but we don't have a political stake in what happens in Oklahoma to the Cherokee people in the same way that you do if you're tied to that land. And so my experience of that level of ethnicity or tie to that sort of racial identity understanding, it's been very complicated for me to work out. I don't, we don't want to drift into Rachel Dolezal territory, so we're trying to be very careful here with this. But that was like a race joke just then for everybody who enjoyed that. I don't want to pass for anything I'm not. So how do I deal with that? And one of the complicated things for me was to hear a narrative from, and I know this for a lot of you, the way you've grown up, you've probably heard the same narrative, and maybe it's one you embrace and feel good about, and that's fine. We can talk about that. But this idea of the need to get back to some sort of golden age in our country, or that we've somehow lost who we were, and that if we can recover that, we'll be strong again. Or something, my grandmother, who was part of the Welsh part, so I think I could tell a joke like this in this room. So my grandmother, my mom's mom, you can't say a bad word in front of her about either the Churches of Christ or labor unions, right? Now, that's not a normal mix of things, I don't think, right? So, are we streaming this possibly? Okay, good. Great. So when we hear stuff like that at church, which is not that often, but if we heard stuff, about how great the country is, we need to restore it to greatness, or with it, on the car ride home, my grandmother would be like, "That's ridiculous. What are they talking about? What do they want to go back to? We want to go back to segregation? Do we want to go back to taking the land from the Indians and from your grandfather's people?" And I'd never met my grandfather, right? But that's how I experienced him, right? It's mediated through that sort of skepticism at this golden age story about who we are. So, I grew up thinking about the past as something of which we need to repent, and of which we need to be serious and to engage it with all the tools of our, serious Christian discipline. And we were at church 3 times a week, so those are the tools I learned. And so as I grew up, and tried to figure out how to do this, like a lot of other people, and for you students, you'll figure this out later. Like, you just take all your personal stuff and throw it into your job stuff and pretend like it's objective. So, just real talk. So, when I found my way into academic study, part of me was curious about whether the concepts and the ideas and the practices we develop in churches have anything to do with a flourishing, good life for people outside of them. Like, the way we talk about what's necessary to thrive as a Christian, does that connect to what we say is fundamental to our politics? And is there a way to bridge that gap without being doctrinaire or being destroying differences or finding a way to do that as good neighbors? Like, can we do that as good neighbors? Or should we withdraw into some little enclave where we try to take care of each other and let the world burn? Or, what's the story? And so I tried to sort that out, but behind that was this question of, like, does the narrative that I absorbed as a person, as a young person, can I bring that together in a meaningful way? Can I be a person who has a background that I know is my DNA is a result of violence and conquest and betrayal and swindle? Like, that's what explains how my face looks like the way it does. Do you know what I'm saying? So how do I make sense of that as somebody who also has this narrative of forgiveness and grace and love being the highest things a human being can achieve, and in fact fundamental to wholeness as God's person? Because God embodies that when God shares human life with us. So anyway, I studied the possibility of forgiveness in politics as my dissertation, and came to my own sort of conclusions about that. And again, for you, those of you who are at lunch, I'd love to talk at length about my dissertation. I know you'd love to hear it. But the upshot is that I think I found a way to reconcile some of those things and be skeptical of other parts of it. But it also put me on a path where it makes sense that I now work at the oldest historically black college west of the Mississippi, and that I work trying to establish it as a place where we are responsive to the needs of the community, where we serve students that other institutions of higher education have historically pushed out and have not cared for, and have not respected, and whose communities they have not tried to work alongside and to cultivate. Because I see the flourishing of institutions that serve under-resourced communities as a part of our repairing the past. And the intellectual work that I've done to sort of come to a place where I think that's important, to me, is not separate from that practical work of making an institution work for the people that it actually serves and the neighborhood it's actually in, and for the society that's actually a part of. And so those are the threads that connect all the stuff that I've tried to do in the sense I tried to make in my own life, to being like a whole person who tries to serve a community that also is trying to be made whole. And I have no idea if I'm getting any of it right, but that's sort of where I'm at with those pieces. So, oh, you have your own.
If it's working, is this working? I came to be interested in this set of issues through two processes. One, a matter of personal discovery and family history, and one, my work as an educator. I grew up in this part of the country. I grew up during the civil rights movement. I was, it would be accurate to say, basically blind to that. One of my grandfathers worked for the Santa Fe Railroad, so was directly affected by the changes in law for transportation and access. I listened to him talk about that. I remember being puzzled why my African American cousins, and they are my cousins, why my African American cousins were not happy. One of the transition points was in my graduate education when I was taking a class while working on my PhD. The professor had us read a couple of things that changed me profoundly. One of them was a speech by Frederick Douglass, What the 4th of July Means to the Negro. It's hard to describe what that did to me. I also got to reading a theologian, which some of the people at the table here will probably know or recognize, James Cone, a black liberation theologian. In terms of my family history, I would have told you at that point that my family had nothing to do with any of this. Great-grandpa didn't even get here till the 1880s. Came here from Germany, landed in Galveston, settled in Fayette County, moved to the High Plains, raised cotton. But I got interested in genealogy, and you know, my ancestors do not consist of just a single man. And so far, basically every strain of my family that I can trace is entangled in slavery and the Civil War on the Confederate side. As an educator, I would like to encourage all of my students and colleagues to be honest about our own history, both the good and the bad. I have said in South Africa on a number of occasions, I think our nation would have profited from a truth and reconciliation process. There is a speech given by F.W. de Klerk called the Rubicon speech that I heard for the first time on videotape in the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. And it brought me to tears, even without really understanding the full ramifications. And I have said on a number of occasions to my students, I cannot point to anything comparable in my nation's history between 1860 and 1964, when Lyndon Johnson says some things in New Orleans that start to face up to our own national history.
This is working. So the name of the conference is Truth, Reconciliation, and Justice. Let's start this way. For me, and I know for others, the word, for everyone, I think, the word justice can mean different things. And even in popular writings now, you hear the term social justice. I'm interested in understanding your perspective on when you hear the word social justice, what does it mean to you? Does it mean reconciliation? Does it mean storytelling? Does it mean truth? Does it mean this redress of some kind? I hesitate to use the word reparations because that's loaded. What does social justice mean when you hear it? Is it a faith question? Is it good citizenship? whoever wants to go first can.
Well, I think because of our sort of hesitancy to pick up that question, just speaks to how difficult it is to answer what the meaning of justice is. I think because most often, especially speaking in this body, so often the question of what justice is needs to be answered by those who have been wronged, and who have had an experience where they have I think something that's core about justice, it has to include both an interpersonal and a relational element, but also a material element for me. And so for those that have sort of felt the material consequences of systems of injustice and inequality, that there would be an aspect of them being able to articulate what it would mean to make amends for that. I guess one helpful way, there's a thinker that a civil rights leader, evangelical civil rights leader named John Perkins, who talks about what he calls the 3 R's of Christian community development: reconciliation, relocation, and redistribution. And I think that's helpful because he brings together the interpersonal, the reconciliation, with this idea that part of what justice looks like is those who sort of have more are investing and willing to share with the relationships and I guess with those who have been on the underside of that privilege. That's probably the best way that I can put it. So I do think that there is a kind of redress, and I've been talking about it recently in terms of sacrificing my sense of comfort and sort of the things that I might feel entitled to so that others can flourish, and being willing to make way for other voices, and to give up some of the things that I feel that, that sort of been inherited as a white person in this country. So maybe other people can answer more thoroughly what justice is, but I do think that it has to include an interpersonal, a spiritual element, and also a material element.
I find it a little easier to talk about social injustice. And this will be a narrow comment because it's really all I know to say about this. For part of my life, and to some extent still, I have been blind to the extent to which culture and social structures, some of the things Chris talked about at lunch, restricted my fellow citizens in a way that I did not recognize. And I am both amazed and appreciative of those men and women at various times and places who were able to see that and to bring it to a level where it becomes visible to me. It's a bit like in business, we sometimes talk about problem finding rather than problem solving. It's recognizing that there's a problem there. And a lot of social injustice, in my opinion, consists of the fact that many of us remain blind to what's happening to our fellow citizens. Not maliciously, we just do.
I would say that social justice starts with the gospel, and the gospel starts with material needs. And material needs are not separate or distinct from spiritual needs. And there's kind of this image from the movie about Martin Luther, the reformer, and they're burning heretics. And I think one of the lines in the movie says, well, who cares, about their bodies, because their souls will go to heaven. And so Christianity has this tendency, this flaw throughout its history to make the spiritual superior or distinct from the material, as if they are diametrically opposed or they're not the same thing. And what did Jesus do? He touched the leper, he fed, he healed. And I know there are a lot of people who are resistant to think that has nothing to do with like believing in Jesus and, you know, being convicted of our sin, and it absolutely does. It absolutely does. So I would say that social justice is absolutely having to do with the material. The Gospel of Luke mentions money more than 70 times. More than 70 times. The Gospel of Luke. I didn't write it. It's not my opinion. It's there. Go count. So these are not just hints from our Gospels. These are urges to follow the Gospel. And how do we do that can get answered in many different ways, and I think you listed several. But I don't think it's a liberal thing. I don't think it's a conservative thing. I think it's a Christian thing. And I think that, Rachel, if I can piggyback on what you were saying, that the answer has to come from the people that have someone else's heel on top of them. And so sometimes we think we know how to answer the questions, but we have to wonder, what are other people's questions? Not what are our questions and what are our answers, but what are their questions? Because we assume we know. And it's just like there's a story of people in Ecuador, some missionaries went and they said, we're going to do something new with Bible stories. We're going to have you act them out. And, you know, this kind of this creative way to engage the Bible stories. And it was a story of the Good Samaritan. And they said, okay, now you all act it out. And they said, okay, well, actually, we want to be in the ditch, and we want to decide if we want to let a rich American help us when we're stuck in the ditch. And everyone was floored, because no one had that perspective that was there, because they were the quote-unquote rich Americans. And so when we hear people's questions and their stories from their perspectives and not ours, then the question of what social justice is a lot easier to contemplate, I think. But I think that the material needs and the spiritual needs ought not to be thought of as separate or distinct. They are one and the same. Because no one should talk to someone about Jesus when they have their heel on them, even if it's unintentional.
Great, so I definitely want to follow those. That's excellent. Thank you. Those are all phenomenal responses. I just want to mention the distinction I think is important by using social as a modifier for justice there. Has to do with the cultural dimensions of this and the structural dimensions. But I want to point out the importance of, or the non-importance of intentions and how that fits into the discussion of social justice. And here's what I mean. A lot of times when we talk about, if something someone says is offensive, or if a particular, set of circumstances is benefiting one group of people and putting another group of people down, benefiting them at the other people's expense, we think, well, I didn't mean to hurt anybody's feelings, right? Or I didn't set up the legal system or whatever, so I shouldn't feel bad about that, right? Or I didn't mean to be born into a family of incredible wealth, and all the workers at my hotel are making minimum wage, and perpetuate that. I didn't mean to do that; just lucked out, right? And there's a tendency to take a discussion of social conditions that are punishing to particular groups of people and benefit others, as if our intention and blame matter, and they just don't. Like, whether you're a nice person who feels like they're not racist, or not sexist, or doesn't think that people who are gay or transgender are less than you, it doesn't really matter how you feel about it in this discussion. In this discussion, it's about whether those people can flourish or not, whether they can thrive or not, and whether the system we have set up benefits the people that happen to be like you or not. And the challenge here is to actually to find a way to listen to people who are dispossessed, and to be able to embrace people's anger and the many ways people react to the reality of their own sense of loss or deprivation or frustration with their own sense of struggle. The challenge of social justice is and one of the challenges is to be able to listen and to absorb that anger and absorb that intensity without being defensive, with just trying to figure out how to help solve the problem, of which, unfortunately, despite the great person you are in your heart, right, you're a part of. So a child that's born into the system of apartheid, who happens to be a white child, right, they may be a great kid, like maybe they share their toys and they're like very sweet to any other kid they meet or whatever. Like, I love this kid that I'm making up right now in my mind. But he still benefits from an atrocious social system. Well, I'm just trying to tell you that in all of us in different places in our lives, we're that kid. And to me, that the social dimension of justice points us to the structures and the plans and the systems that seem like they're natural, seem like just the way the world works, but in fact the result of human choices. And they require human work, right? That I think happens in partnership with God and is part of the outbreaking of the gospel. But I think that it requires human work in cultural and in social and in government and in institutional and educational context and all sorts of contexts, not just to undo it, but to make it possible for creation to continue in those places. And when systems are in place that keep people poor, that keep them hungry, that keep people classed out of certain possibilities, we stifle the creative energy of God. And to me, that's where the connection comes with our moral imagination, our ability to be to actually follow the call of Jesus to touch and to heal and to feed.
Does anybody have any questions yet? Do you want to jump in? Because I'm going to ask a different kind of question, kind of take us away from that a little bit. But it was a question, and I've been keeping notes all day, and so they're all jumbled in my head. So I apologize for that. But one of the things that, when we talk about Zimbabwe, especially in southern Africa, the government said, we're going to take this land back from the white farmers. And I'm not sure what my question here is, but I would like you guys to answer it anyway. Was that justice from a sense when they took that farmland back, when they kicked the white farmers out and said, we're taking it back because of what your forefathers did many, many, many years ago, we are going to take action to now create a more just system. So I'm not sure there's a question in there, but I think there is.
I will argue the somewhat cynical position that justice is simply not possible, that our world is so fallen and so sinful that we all live with injustice and there's no real corrective to it. One could make the argument, it's a stronger argument in the U.S. than it is there, but one can make the argument that the land didn't originally belong to the Ndebele and the Shona, that it belonged to the Bushmen. And so when Mr. Mugabe's government takes the land away from whites and gives it to the Shona and the Ndebele, it's not theirs either. So that what you have is successive generations of people who have claimed land and in some cases mistreated the people who were just ahead of them. So South Africa, while it has not resolved this problem, I think the South African government is doing a much better job of trying to feel its way forward to not to make the situation worse for anybody, or not much worse, to try to find a way to bring willing buyers and willing sellers together. I think Mark Solms is a wonderful example of a voluntary effort that ought to be imitated. I think that's all I know to say about that.
So I'll say this is, so I don't have an expertise in South Africa, so I'll definitely defer to our, Southern Africa, so I'll defer to our experts on the, on that to satisfy the repatriation arguments or whatever. But the, one thing I do think about that's comparable in the U.S. context is and I'm going to disagree with you here on one thing. So I don't think I think it is true that perfect justice is not possible. I would definitely agree with that. So the idea of, we'll all sit down with our ledgers, and at the end of like a 6 to 8 week conference process, we'll have a list of all the ways that property should revert to the rightful owners, and that the bank accounts that should be full that are now empty, and the full that should now be empty. We can do the math. Basically, we can sit down, if we work hard enough, we can do the math and get everything back to the people that should have it. We'll find a way to quantify this, or we'll find a way to give the authority back to the right people. Maybe there's a way to do that, and if somebody can knock that out for us, that'd be fantastic. But I do think that I don't think it means the opposite is true, that there's no justice that really is those situations that's more preferable as a achievement of justice than not. So I guess the way that I put it is that it's possible to have a little more justice, and that for a lot of the people, a lot of the time, a little more justice makes a difference between misery and having enough, and so I think of of policy towards American Indians in the United States in this context. You basically have generations of conquest and bribery and swindle and betrayal, all the family tree stuff I was talking about. But then you also have the specific periods of Indian policy between the U.S. and the various nations, internal nations, and the result of that is you have the allotment period where they try to break up the reservations they've set aside to individuals, and they have the termination period where they just try to do away with the whole system altogether and send people back to the cities and try to reform and assimilate folks. And out of that comes a sovereignty struggle, which is the struggle to return formal recognition of tribal sovereignty and there may be people in the room who have much more intimate experience with this than I do, and I would love to hear from you. But it's a process it's sort of happening concurrently with the civil rights movement in the United States, but it's basically just an amazing reversal of Indian policy in the U.S., where they go from basically being on their heels culturally all over the country to organizing efforts in various places and using court cases and using different modes of political mobilization and all sorts of connections and creative ways to fight back and protest movements to achieve a new era of recognition for the integrity and the integrity over time of tribal governments in the United States. And that's not the same thing as reversion of land, right? But for the tribes who have achieved that, for the people who struggled for that different level of political recognition, it is the restoration of a certain level of sovereignty, a certain level of control of their own political destiny, control over the disposition of their territories, control over the remains of their ancestors. And those things do make a significant difference. So I think that's a situation of a little more justice, in part because they have a little more power, right? So the way that cycles of violence work, and it's really hard to quantify these things in a blanket sense, and that's why I don't want to speak too closely to the Zimbabwe situation without having a more profound knowledge of it. But I do think that it's our resistance to perfect justice should not make us stop, should not keep us from saying that it's possible to restore something in these situations where people can have certain measures of authority or of money, or where we put the brakes on things that seem impractical or very hard or very controversial because we think that maybe they won't work or they'll be too scandalous or whatever. But sometimes the political possibilities are more than we expect, and even if we don't achieve reparations for every community that's been dispossessed in the United States, we can do something. And that effort is not a one-time effort; it's an ongoing thing. But I think that it's possible to demand everything, and to do so in a way that destroys the political fabric and makes future possibilities foreclosed, and that would be bad. So I think, you know, going to war and taking property versus, you know, allowing the situation to persist with no changes. I think there's a place in between that where we can actually achieve some meaningful stuff, maybe more than we think, and it's worth a shot to try that stuff.
I don't think Chris and I disagree about that. If I were going to tell you what I think might have been ideal in Zimbabwe, it would look more like we go to white farmers and we say, what happened here really wasn't fair, and we need to somehow redress the grievances of the people who live on your farm, and take part of the farm, or over time let them earn part of the farm. There does need to be a transfer of land ownership in South Africa. We need more black ownership. We need it in Zimbabwe. One of the white men I talked to this summer in Zimbabwe said to me, some of these white guys own multiple farms. They didn't need them all. It wouldn't have been any problem with some of this land being given back. The problems in Zimbabwe have been more the inept methods. What Mr. Mugabe has done is given multiple farms to loyal party members who in many cases don't yet know how to run them, although as we talk today, there's some of them figuring it out.
I'm going to answer this question from a little bit of a different vantage point. So oftentimes people talk about South Africa, or they used to talk about it, especially as a kind of miracle. The moment, 1994, was this moment where, and even, you know, in the early 90s, when people felt like anything could happen, that they sort of grasped and tasted and sensed a better world was possible. And there was lots of talk about reconciliation. And Nelson Mandela, you know, took a very conciliatory approach, and they did do this willing buyer, willing seller kind of setup to how they wanted to try to redistribute wealth and resources from the minority to the majority. And it was, you know, it was a really powerful time, and I think there was this rhetoric of building a new nation, one where both white and black South Africans would have a place and would belong. And I think there's something beautiful about that, and it sort of depended on this idea that it's actually, for like our long-term futures and our long-term survival, it actually works better if people sort of voluntarily sort of come to terms with the past and then seek to make amends rather than have some kind of structural solution. But based on my experiences sort of being in South Africa just recently, what you have now is a situation where not much has changed. There have been some substantial changes, but not much has changed. That system that sort of relied on like goodwill and inspiring people on the highest ideals that were actually really influenced by Christianity, that when it came time, like people will talk about non-racialism and they'll talk about reconciliation, but when it came time to figuring out concrete ways to sort of give opportunity for the transfer of land and resources and material stuff, that hasn't happened. And as a result, what you have now is growing discontent on the ground. And you have calls now, which we haven't seen in 20 years, for the right to have violent takeover and transfer. And there's discussion about how there needs to be an economic transition. And people have almost given up on the dream of the possibility of a non-racial democracy, at least the people who are stuck in poverty. And the average wealth gap right now between white South Africans have actually gotten wealthier since 1994, whereas black South Africans have actually stayed there have been some opportunities for the growth in the black middle class, but a lot of black South Africans have stayed in poverty, and the unemployment rate in townships runs from 25 to 60%, whereas the unemployment rate in white communities is less than 1%. The wealth gap is 7 times between a black household and a white household. So now we're in a really interesting situation. And it's one that I think many people argue, or at least the critics are arguing, needs some kind of structural solution and intervention. And that's where you get the fear of, well, it should look like Zimbabwe, or we need something else. So I would like to still I want to believe in the power of sort of personal conversion and collective conversion, and how collective well-being and a common good can really shape people and provide new possibilities and new relationships. But I'm just saying that the other side of it is when that doesn't happen, the discontent and the anger grows, and you're only on your way towards a violent confrontation and continuing a cycle of violence.
So I'm definitely not an expert on Zimbabwe things, but I'm going to reflect back on your question that was, I can't give all these answers to, but your question was, is it justice when they came? And I think that my question in response was, is it justice if nothing happens? And I think that most of us would agree, or all of us would agree, that it wouldn't be justice if nothing changed and if things remained the same. But I think what comes to my mind is the writings of who I would consider a modern day prophet, who follows in the lines of Frederick Douglass, and that the piece that you referenced earlier about the 4th of July, and that's Ta-Nehisi Coates. And it's a little bit dated, but not very much dated, and the ideas are not dated, but he wrote a piece on the case for reparations in the Atlantic. And so regardless of one's political persuasion, I would recommend that you read it. It's easily accessible online, because reparations, certain things come to mind, but what he talked about was a lot of what Lamar spoke about, of what happens when people want to create businesses, and when what Chris talked about earlier in your luncheon talk, when people want to bring businesses into the community, when people want to bring clinics where there have never been clinics, and fresh fruits and daycares and things like that. That is what he's talking about when he talks about reparations. He's talking about repairing a community and bringing necessary things. Okay, so I would read someone like him from a marginalized community who is saying, this is what I see happen to my community, this is what I've seen, and here is the history. And then the question about how do we answer it without just going back and saying, oh, look at what you are a part of, now I'm going to take it back. Because that is not going to lead to healing. And I think it's obvious also that it's not just about land. Because if it was just about land, you could make that switch. But because those statistics remain the same, it's a lot more about power and internalized power and racism. Otherwise, these things wouldn't continue to happen.
Susan.
So in Lamar's chart, he talked about beginning, I mean, if we're really looking at an ideal system, it begins with a strong government. But in America, it seems to me we've reached a point where people think government is evil. I'm anti-government. I can certainly be your president, for instance. And yet, if there isn't a strong government, how can you create these systems that we need? And so I'm curious about how you all think the role of government plays into these questions of justice.
So let me repeat, if you couldn't hear Susan, and correct me. What is the role of government in these kind of justice? Because as we learned, strong government is required for rule of law, property rights, which lead to prosperity and hopefully peace and justice. Is that a fair question? So what is the role of government when you think about justice?
I don't have a simple answer to that. It's obviously essential, and government is a much messier process than I was taught or learned when I was in school. You know, they draw nice charts about how laws are created and how decisions are made, and the reality is not that. I've had a friend who worked as a lobbyist in Washington, who earned his salary for the rest of his life by being in the room one day when a tax law was written, and said, you know, we should exempt new factories that have already been started in terms of construction. And the congressman around the table did that, and he was treated by his company for the rest of his career as having earned his pay, and he had. It's a human process. It's an imperfect process. There are times when I am really concerned about the politics of my fellow citizens. Some of them do seem to be some of them seem to assume that the goods we have just come out of the ground spontaneously, that highways build themselves, and that police departments rise up as volunteers and protect us, and that the military is they're all volunteers. Government does those things for us. It is possible, in my opinion, to have a government that is overly intrusive. It is possible to have a government that's too large a part of the economy. But we have had and still have strong government, and we should keep it. The notion that any part of our country could secede and be successful is, in my opinion, folly. And I lived in Illinois when Western Illinois tried to secede, because the young man who was leading that was one of the graduates of our university. The governor locked him up. You know, we were going to call it Forgottonia, because we'd been forgotten by the Chicago. And I periodically, of course I'm still living in Virginia, I periodically take flack because I'm from Texas, and everybody knows that. And someone down here will announce that Texas is going to secede. Well, they'd be dumb if they did.
So let me I've got a few minutes left. Can you separate material issues from justice? Talked about the book of Luke. Much of what we've talked about finds its way back to wealth, property, and so again, I'm not framing this question at all, but when you think about economic justice, again, what do you think about? Because I think I think we all have very different viewpoints of what economic justice means. Does it mean equal opportunity for everyone, where there is no systemic or no institutional structure that gets in the way of opportunity, or does it mean some kind of equal outcome? And there are some who would say that justice is just equal opportunity. So, again, I think as people of faith, I think that is our material possessions in large part give us comfort. Well, they not in large part, they do give us comfort, and part of what you've talked about at lunch and what you referred to as material possessions, somehow that is tied to justice. So any thoughts on that?
I think that property rights are absolutely closely tied to justice, that it's not possible to have justice without very careful attention to property. Our Declaration of Independence talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the English original, which he's paraphrasing, says life, liberty, and property. So the rights to own the product of my own hands, to do my own work, to benefit from that is absolutely essential to justice. Now, you've also asked a broader question that I'm going to duck, except to say I think Chris is right that we can't just say, I would agree to equal opportunity only if you could guarantee me that every person was at exactly the same starting point, and we are not. I have benefited from multiple generations of, for their time, good, well-educated, relatively prosperous people. That's a marvelous advantage. There's a social cap. What I tried to convey a little bit when I talked about some of the people on Mark Salm's farm, who, when he began to work with them, were unable to even have a conversation with him. And that comes from having been damaged by generations where you assume that you are in this circumstance, you somehow deserve this, and there are no opportunities beyond this. One doesn't just snap one's fingers and say, here, we now give you equal opportunity. You don't really have it.
So I'm going to take a stab at something, see if it makes sense to you. So one of the ways I frame this is, what do we think the resurrection means? Because it's not, the whole story is not just like Jesus died a hero, was like super brave by taking on the cross, right? It seems to me that the resurrection is a way of, not necessarily bookending, but at least connecting with this deeper thread throughout throughout Scripture, throughout the liturgy and the stories of the church, that that aims at affirming the fundamental goodness and meaningfulness of creation itself. Right? So in the same way that humanity wrecks our home, this actually struck me pretty strongly when you were talking about the evolutionary history and the reality of the earliest human remains, and I was thinking about how that we basically turned around and plundered the same continent for about 500 years. And I thought, what more human story is there to tell than like we wrecked our home? We do it all the time because we think it'll make us happier or richer, and it does for a while, and then we realize it's on fire and caving in. So look for that in the future. Right? But the reality of the story of creation being given for not just for our use but for our participation, to share with God's creative work in the garden, and to name, and to participate in that project of creating and being delighted in what it means to share the space of creation with God. We blight that project in various ways, and then God sends in some sort of energy to try to redeem that, transform that process. And I think that the one way to read the story of Christ's participation with us on earth is that effort at asking us to join once again in the work of creation, and to know that even death is not a barrier to that, and that's not the final word, and that our destruction is not what the world is destined for if we will join with God in God's Spirit. And that's what I hope it means. And I think that's one reason why the church for centuries didn't even think private property was a good idea, and forbade the charging of interest as a sin, is because the goods of creation are given to all for their good enjoyment, but some have taken them to themselves as if they belong to them, and they do not, right? So there's a part of the Christian tradition that affirms creation as a source of delight and of nourishment and sharing. It's a place where we share things with each other. And so I don't mean to argue against private property necessarily, but even when you see the origins of the sort of Enlightenment thinking about consent-based government and the strict role of government being primarily in the protection of the right to private property, and Locke is arguing about what the commons should be like and how much you should enclose. And one thing Locke says is that you should never enclose You should only close so much of the commons as you can without allowing people to starve. That if you've enclosed so much of the commons that people can't eat, you've done too much. Right? And I think that's, we've sort of forgotten that lesson from the origins of our current political economy, that, even in those Enlightenment thinkers, there's a concern that we will use private property as a way to accrue wealth and accrue possessions in a way that will deprive other people of what they need to live. And so, I think that there's, when we talk about, is it outcomes, is it opportunities, is it material possessions, what's the framework where we see the work of justice unfolding and sort of being able to theorize what social justice actually means in practice. And for me, the theological dimension of this is to ask whether people are able to enjoy the sufficient gifts of creation in a way that is adequate to their humanity. And I think that often, I think that protecting private property can be a means to that, so I don't think that's necessarily contradictory. But I do think that it requires us to think carefully about what the role of our common life really is, and it challenges us to really re-envision our rhetoric of individualism and our rhetoric of freedom and of independence as if those are the only political goods. I think those are political goods that should be preserved, but there are others. And the conversation we're having right now about what the social political goods are there things like houses and like food. Like, why would you consent to a government of what you would give up your right to fight for yourself and forage for yourself and be independent? Why would we're just going to go old school, contract theory, right? Like, why would you consent to that if the result would be that you couldn't eat? Like, none of us would agree to that situation, and yet many of our citizens are in that space. So how do we find a way to structure justice so that we at least guarantee a minimum? And the reality is that we all know people who are hostile to even guaranteeing a minimum for people. And I think whatever we think about guarantees of shelter or food or jobs or whatever, guaranteed income, there are all sorts of interesting arguments to have about that, what's effective and who has a right to what. But I think at the very least we can agree that we can argue for certain sorts of minimums of what a decent society does for its people. And I think that there's a theological argument to be made for that, and that I would ground that in creation. So.
The connection between the material and the spiritual. I was here in 2009 when we had the financial collapse, which was, right when I was sort of entering my professional life. And since then, I've been a PhD student, and actually, that has been really eye-opening for me because there's been, while I'm very elite in terms of my ability to access this amazing education and get this degree, I've also had a number of financial insecurities that have come over the last 6 years. And realizing what financial insecurity does to your life and how the anxiety and the sense of kind of overwhelming imprisonment, what it does to you and how it constrains your imagination, your creativity, your ability to function has been really eye-opening for me because that wasn't my background at all growing up. And so I've been challenged, I think, especially as I've been watching my peers go on and buy houses and establish themselves, as little of what I spoke about this morning. I've been really challenged to rethink what we mean by the good life, and what does the gospel tell us about what it means to live a good life? Is the good life, really about, I don't know, is it about owning property? Is it about being able to send my child to the best school possible and preserve this line of wealth and resources within my family or my cultural group or racial group? I mean, these are the questions I'm asking myself because of my own particular story. But I do think that there are ways that we can imagine a good life that includes flourishing of all people and doesn't pit our struggle to live and survive against someone else's. And so often that's the rhetoric we hear, and this idea of like class warfare, or what will it mean if there are certain policies passed, or even if we consider these questions that we've been talking about reparations. And I really feel so strongly that that my flourishing needs to be connected to the flourishing of others. And I also, just in terms of Christianity, I'm also really struck by how often we use these arbitrary systems that we've all spoken about, these arbitrary ways we came to be where we are in the world. They often get masked with the language of blessing. And we assume that if, I'm doing well in life, then it's because I'm blessed. And if I'm not, then it's somehow because I am not blessed. And I think that's been incredibly harmful spiritual rhetoric that gets from, I think, what's the core of the gospel, which is that we are, to the extent that we can say that we are blessed in a way to participate in a rich communal life with one another. And I sort of love, I guess, what it would be like Martin Luther King's ultimate vision of a beloved community, and it's a question of how we get to that beloved community. And I think without combining the material and the spiritual and reframing what we mean by the good life, we're never going to arrive at the beloved community in this country. And maybe also getting rid of some of our problematic ways of talking about blessing, or rethinking what does blessing mean, and how do I use whatever blessing I have to serve and pour ourselves out for the sake of the world.
I think I don't know how much time we have, but I just want to follow up on what you were saying about the language of blessing, and I want to reiterate what I said before. Go read the Gospel of Luke. If there's a question about if material is separate or distinct from the spiritual, go read the Gospel of Luke. And what did Jesus do when he came back after he was resurrected? He ate a piece of fish. He was hungry. If you think the material isn't connected to the spiritual, go read the Gospels. And look around. And I think, following up on what my colleague said, think about what other people are going through, and if their highest aspiration is to have prosperity, and how we look at prosperity and how someone else looks at prosperity. Because for someone else, prosperity might just be having a bed to sleep in and a piece of bread to eat once a day. So when we even use the word prosperity as we have today, it doesn't always mean the same thing that it does for us as it does for someone else. And we're so reticent to talk about how humans best flourish because of our political discourse, because as soon as I've been somewhere and we were talking about Dostoevsky, and I said a quote, I didn't even make it was right from the text, and he said, one character says, I'm responsible to all people at all times, and a man stood up and said, you're teaching socialism, and I was like, whoa, we're reading Dostoevsky, shh, it's okay. I am not, as a pastor, going to promote capitalism or socialism. I'm trying to follow the gospel, and I will critique anything that harms human beings. So we better be ready to critique ourselves and capitalism and socialism, because we're looking for human flourishing, not being right or wrong. And so that's about following the gospel, and that means saying that we can be wrong, myself included, and we have to constantly check that.
I think we can all say amen to that. We are out of time, so if we can give our panelists a round of applause, please.